Hello everyone, I'm Jeff Fake. I'm the co-organizer of Economy, and I'll be moderating the panel called Can Bitcoin Scale? In the perspective of political, economic, and technology. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Roger Ver. I was the first person in the entire world to start investing in Bitcoin startups. Currently today, I'm the CEO of Bitcoin.com, and I fully support Bitcoin Cash because it's the same version of Bitcoin that I got involved with back in 2011, and it has the potential to provide more economic freedom for every single human being on the planet.
I'm Samson Mow. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Blockstream and previously ran BTC China.
Great. So starting off, I would like to have both of your opinion on, the vision for Bitcoin scaling. So not as a representative of a certain entity, but what is your vision for Bitcoin scaling, and how should Bitcoin scale?
You first.
So we already know how Bitcoin should scale because we had 7 or 8 years of history, and we watched as Bitcoin had blocks that were maybe 1 or 2 kilobytes. And more people heard about it and started to use it as money, and the blocks grew into 5 kilobyte blocks, and then 10 kilobyte blocks, and 50 kilobyte blocks, and 100 kilobyte blocks. As it grew to having more and more people around the world starting to use it. They were playing games on the internet and buying and selling things, and people all over the world were starting to use it. And as more people heard about it, then the blocks grew to half a megabyte, and then 3/4 of a megabyte, and then 1 megabyte. And Bitcoin became this worldwide phenomenon that we have today, as the blocks simply grew year after year as more and more people started to use it. And the cost of the hardware to validate that and to do the mining in terms of hashes per second per dollar, everything got more efficient and cheaper for people to use, and cheaper and easier for people around the world to use. So we have 7 or 8 years of empirical evidence as to how we should scale Bitcoin. And we have that empirical evidence that showed it worked amazingly well to bring Bitcoin from nothing to what this worldwide phenomenon that we have today. If something's working and working that incredibly well, don't break it. But unfortunately, that's exactly what proponents of the 1 megabyte block size limit have done, and people working for a company like Blockstream have done. They've literally broken the goose that was laying the golden eggs. And so I just saying, let's take the safe path, which is do exactly what we've been doing that grew Bitcoin into this worldwide phenomenon that it is today. And that economic formula is still alive and well in the form of Bitcoin Cash. And that economic formula has been mutilated and nearly destroyed in the form of Bitcoin Core. And that's why in the long term, I'm much, much, much more bullish about Bitcoin Cash than Bitcoin Core.
All right, you, Samson.
Okay. So I think I'll speak for myself, not for Blockstream or anything. I'm not a Bitcoin Core developer, so I don't speak for Bitcoin Core as well. So it's just my personal opinion. I think scaling Bitcoin, we have to take into consideration the computer science aspect of it. We can't just make things up. We actually have to look at the code, and we have to follow the consensus rules. So if you look at what Bitcoin Core has been doing, is that they've been scaling all along so that everything is backwards compatible. So you have 0.16 today. If you spin up like 0.009, it'll still work together, right? And it's scaling in a way that actually lays the groundwork for new things. So when Bitcoin is scaling, they're actually making sync times faster. So even though the Bitcoin blockchain is far bigger today, it's several gigabytes in size, we can still synchronize it in a day or so. So if you're running an exchange, you know that this is very important. If you're running an exchange, you actually need to validate all the transactions. If someone sends you 1,000 Bitcoin, you have to make sure it confirms before you credit them with 1,000 Bitcoin to trade. You can't just hope that it confirms or not care about that. You have to make sure everything is there. And to do that, you actually need the software to scale and to function. And blockchains inherently don't scale because they are flood networks where every transaction goes out to every node. So the analogy I like to give is that if YouTube was decentralized, every time you post a video, everybody in this room would have to download that video in order for everything to continue. And that is very burdensome. So the way to scale a blockchain, I think, with Bitcoin would be to move to layer 2 scaling solutions where everything is cryptographically linked to the main chain. So if you want an analogy, it's kind of like a gold standard where a US dollar is backed by gold, except for it's cryptographically enforced. Bitcoin in a side chain, Bitcoin on Lightning, you can always cash back out to the main chain and actually get that asset. So to answer the question, I think the scaling that works is to take an engineering standpoint to look at the code and to follow consensus rules and to build layer 2 solutions.
So, okay, so my understanding of your answer is that the on-chain scaling is not feasible, and there has to be a second layer technology. And what's your view on that? Do you believe the future of second layer technologies, or do you think that on-chain scaling is possible?
Are you asking me or Samson?
I'm asking Roger you.
So I'd like to quote one of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, who said that we need to judge government programs by their effects rather than their intents. And we've seen that happen here with the 1 megabyte block size limit, and this proponent from Samson personally and a lot of his friends, they say we need to build everything on top of layer 2, and we'll strangle layer 1 to do it. And they don't quite use that word, but we've seen exactly what the effect, even if they had good intentions, the effect was that Bitcoin lost its first mover advantage. The market cap of altcoins has skyrocketed. The number of transactions happening on the Bitcoin core network today is about half of what it was in December of last year. Bitcoin Core is having negative merchant adoption around the world. Bitcoin Cash is having positive merchant adoption around the world. So even if Samson and Blockstream and Bitcoin Core supporters had the absolute best intentions in their heart, we have the empirical evidence to show that the effects were negative and incredibly damaging to Bitcoin. So let's judge things by their effects and their results, not the intent of the people that were putting it together. So again, we had 8 years of empirical evidence showing what worked and worked incredibly well to scale Bitcoin to millions of people around the world. If something's working and working that incredibly well, don't deviate from that course. Yet that's exactly what they've succeeded in doing for Bitcoin. They've shattered the Bitcoin ecosystem to 1,001 different altcoins and delayed the adoption of cryptocurrencies around the world by years. And there's nothing we can do to change the past, but we can work together to change the future. And Bitcoin Cash has the best roadmap to scale for people all over the world to use it as cash for the world by just following the exact same computer science formula and economic formula that led Bitcoin to being this worldwide phenomenon that it is today.
So the question is, not representing a certain entity, but personally, do you believe that the correct Dr. Wright share the idea that Lightning Network, as a mesh doesn't work in practice? And do you share the same view, or? And also another question for you is that do you think the block size of the Bitcoin should be limited to 1 megabyte, or should be increased along with the Lightning Network?
I stepped out of the room for his talk, so I don't know what he talks about.
And I'd actually like to point out how rude he was when he stepped out of the room. He said, "You're going to stay for fake Toshi?" And whether or not Craig is Satoshi or not, the things that he's saying are right in line with what the version of Bitcoin that I signed up for, which was peer-to-peer electronic cash for the entire world.
Okay, so before we got into this, we had to sort of settle the name for it. So I guess people call it Bitcoin Core, Bitcoin Cash, or BTC, BCH. Bitcoin Cash is Bitcoin, Bitcoin Core is Bitcoin. So what's the difference between Bitcoin and Bitcoin? What's the difference with the BTC and BCH? It's complicated. So what's your view on the terms?
Well, let's go back for one thing. Block size is not 1 megabyte now. It was changed to block weight, not block size. So now blocks can be up to 4 megabytes in block weight.
So in economic terms, this is called an actual subsidy, where they actually don't count the amount of space in the SegWit portion of a block, the same as the amount of space in the other portion of a block. So, and if you go and study economics, you realize that subsidies lead to economically inefficient outcomes, and that's exactly what we have going on here with the SegWit space.
What about the block subsidy?
What block subsidy?
12.5 bitcoins per block.
What about it?
It's a subsidy. You just said subsidies
it's the mining
are bad.
reward. No, it's a totally different type. So in economic terms, you're taking money from one group and giving it to another. That's what's going on with the block space. You're charging lower fees for space used in the SegWit portion of a block rather than the other portion of a block.
Well, there's actually a mathematical reason for that, but let's just keep it general. So your question was the names,
The
right?
name of the Bitcoin. So
Well-
the fundamental question is, what's the origin? Like, what is the Bitcoin that Satoshi intended to build? That's the question. And,
Should it be used for coffee payments?
well, yeah.
Okay, so I guess naming-wise, Bitcoin is still Bitcoin. If you look at all the markets, all the exchanges, Bitcoin is BTC, and then Bcash is BCH. So I think the name is clear what people have accepted right now. But the litmus test is this. If you want to be paid with a Bitcoin today, and I give you something else, will you accept that as Bitcoin? And I think that's the easiest way to tell what is Bitcoin, right? If you ask for payment in Litecoin and I send you Dogecoin, you won't accept that, right? So the simplest test is just to ask someone if they want Bitcoin, then what do you want me to send you?
So I'd just like to point out that Samson assured me backstage that we were going to be civil and that nobody was going to call anything Bcash or any derogatory names. So it looks like he's broken his promise there, just like the promise to the entire world. When I got involved in Bitcoin, one of my very first questions was, can this scale to be money for the entire world and for everyone to use? And so I went on bitcoin.org and read the details about how Bitcoin could scale to the world. And it went over the exact mathematics involved as to how much bandwidth it would take, how much hard drive space it would take, how much processing power it would take. And it was clear. Bitcoin could scale to be money for the entire world. And then later, a bunch of people came to Bitcoin, much later, who started spreading all these lies and using censorship and propaganda to spread them, saying that Bitcoin can't scale to be money for the entire world. But anybody out there is welcome to go to the Internet Archive and look up bitcoin.org and read the articles about the scalability of Bitcoin from back in 2011, 2012, even in 2013. It was very clear. And so all through that time, there was this one single version of Bitcoin. And people with Samson's view of Bitcoin, that it shouldn't be used for coffee payments and it isn't for people that earn less than $2 a day, split. And so this one single version of Bitcoin on August 1st of last year split into both Bitcoin Cash, which is cash for the world, and Bitcoin Core, which is now a science project with Raspberry Pis and not usable in commerce. And that's why we're seeing people that actually run businesses stopping accepting Bitcoin Core and starting to accept Bitcoin Cash. So I think we have very, very different views for what the goal of Bitcoin is. And you're nodding your head. What is Bitcoin to you, Samson?
Well, Bitcoin is the new form of money.
So do $50 fees and hours or day-long waits for confirmations? Is
Well,
that
let me
money
ask you
to
this. How much are fees right now, right this minute?
So fees right now is maybe 20 cents per transaction on the Bitcoin Core network because it's having half as many transactions per day as there were in December of last year, just a few months ago, because people have stopped using Bitcoin because of the high fees they experienced, because of the horrible user experience that they've experienced. And the reason I feel so passionate about this is because I used to hold a giant amount of Bitcoin before the split. And suddenly this thing happened. And then I had to go and reallocate my position and sell the vast majority of my Bitcoin Core to buy more Bitcoin Cash. I did more than just about anybody in the world to help spread adoption of Bitcoin as money in the world. And now I'm having to do it again with Bitcoin Cash because Bitcoin Core is no longer usable in commerce. Today, the fees are low again. That's great. But in December, they were high. We need money that's reliable month after month, and one that you don't have to pay $50 one month in fees and then 20 cents the next month. And even 20 cents is far too high. To use a Bitcoin Cash to make a payment today, you only have to pay about 1/10 of a penny, about one single Korean won to do so. That's useful in commerce. That's useful as money. One that costs $50 one month, and it's not just $50 for one single transaction. If you're running a business, you accept lots of smaller payments from your customers, and then you send out bigger payments to your suppliers. So I can't even count how many times I had to pay more than $1,000 for one single Bitcoin transaction. That's more than $1,000 in fees to pay our suppliers because we received a bunch of smaller payments and then had to send out a bigger payment. That's not usable in commerce. And we're seeing all this talk about the Lightning Network and this and that. I wish the Lightning Network the best of luck. I'm very, very skeptical that it'll work at all. But at the end of the day, we're seeing the empirical evidence. It's easier for people to switch from Bitcoin Core to altcoins than it is for people to migrate from Bitcoin Core to the Lightning Network on top of Bitcoin Core, and that's why we've seen the market caps of altcoins exploding around the world.
Yeah. So the commerce usage. The question for both of you, well, actually for Samson, is are you concerned of current situation where the Bitcoin's dominance in terms of usage and adoption, or I should say the market capitalization compared to other cryptocurrencies declining? Like, are you concerned, or do you think there's a correlation between scaling, not scale? Well, I guess the block size limit and the adoption and the merchant usage.
I don't think the block size limit actually impedes usage. It's just like if you go to a restaurant that's busy, you'll wait, right? Because the food is good. If blocks are getting full, then it's a normal thing because people are using it, right? And we eventually do need to pay the miners for putting blocks in the blockchain. The block subsidy will keep on decreasing. The next one's in a few years. And then we'll cut down to half again, right? It'll keep going lower and lower. So fees do need to replace the block subsidy over time in order to provide security for the blockchain. For your question about market cap, I don't really think it's a good metric to look at market cap, because I could make something today and sell you one. I could make a trillion coins, sell you one, and for $1. But do I have a $1 trillion market cap? Probably not, right? So Roger was saying altcoins are dominating everything like that, but a lot of altcoins have very little liquidity. If you were accepting payments in some altcoin, it'll be very hard to sell that for fiat on an exchange because the market depth is low. There's very little liquidity. Bitcoin is still the most liquid asset of all the digital currencies out there, and it's almost like the reserve currency. If you look at when prices drop, like right now, we're in a bit of a dip. Everything drops a lot, but Bitcoin retains the most value out of all the coins, except for a few exceptions, but that's normal, right?
If I may ask you, Samson, what do you think about the metric that the number of Bitcoin Core transactions are about half as many as in December, while the altcoins are having more transactions than they were previously? Does that concern you at all?
There's a blog post, I think, maybe from Jimmy Song. He was writing about crypto Keynesians and crypto Austrians. And it's just different thoughts of schools of economics. So Keynesians think that transactions are the most important criteria. So if money is moving very, very rapidly through the network and there's lots and lots of transactions, that's a good thing. But then Austrians think that solid, sound money is the most important thing. And I think that's probably where we differ. You think transactions are most important, throughput, but I think sound money is most important.
So I think that's a bit of a strong man, because it's the throughput and the transactional velocity that the money has the ability to do that helps make it sound money. And if you're not able to move your money and send it around the world, then it's not good money. And Bitcoin Cash is easily usable and sendable and receivable with anyone, anywhere in the world for less than a penny. How much was Bitcoin Core again in December of last year?
I don't know, but Dogecoin is cheaper than Bitcoin Cash.
But it doesn't have a limited supply, and that's another important
Dogecoin
characteristic
has a limited
of Bitcoin.
supply.
We'll have to look it up. I don't think too many people are using it in commerce. Because
or even Litecoin has a limited supply, and it's also faster block times, 2.5 minutes. It's great for payments.
So luckily, Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash already have a much bigger market share than Litecoin. We don't have to wait for a confirmation in a block for transactions to be acceptable by a merchant. So the rule, probably before you got involved in Bitcoin, so you might not be aware of this, but the rule was called first seen, first safe, which meant as soon as you broadcasted your transaction to the network, that was the transaction that the miners are going to include in a block, which made it perfectly safe for merchants all around the world to accept as soon as it was broadcast to the network, so basically instantly. And then a bunch of people who came to Bitcoin much later started advocating for this system called replace by fee, which meant that you can replace the transaction with a different transaction at any point up until it's included in a block. And on the Bitcoin network, it's about 10 minutes on average per block. On Litecoin, it's 2.5 minutes. So they get all excited about it. Well, it's 2.5 minutes on Litecoin rather than 10 minutes on Bitcoin. That doesn't matter one bit when you have the policy of first seen, first safe, which means the transactions on Bitcoin Cash are instant. Why would you want to wait around for a block when you can do it instantly? And that's how Bitcoin was up until a bunch of people who came to Bitcoin later changed the way in which Bitcoin worked and made it less usable as money for the world.
So I would counter that nobody changed anything. the clients are compatible, the consensus rules are still in place. If you spin up an old version of Bitcoin, it still syncs. You can still transact.
So I'd love to defer to a fantastic essay written by Vitalik Buterin, sitting right here in the front row here, the creator of Ethereum, that talks about how soft forks are coercive because they bring and force everybody along to go with the new change to the network, whereas hard forks aren't because they're consensual. You can decide whether or not you want to fork off with the new hard fork. So these changes to the network, while yes, technically backwards compatible, forced everybody to go along with it because they didn't have any choice.
Except for the people that didn't go along with it because they don't need to go along with it. There are still clients on the network that don't have SegWit upgraded.
So I would implore everybody to read Vitalik Buterin's article on soft forks versus hard forks. It's a fantastic essay by one of a fantastic mind that's alive today that the entire world is indebted to thanks to his existence here. And anyhow, read Vitalik, read everything Vitalik writes. It's fantastic.
You know who created soft forks, right? In Bitcoin? Satoshi.
Fantastic. And you know who created first seen, first safe? Satoshi. You know I'll quote Satoshi again. Satoshi Nakamoto said that the ultimate solution is to simply allow the blocks to get as big as they need to be. And I agree with Satoshi on that as well.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So back to the question that I just, you mentioned that the crypto Austrian and crypto Keynesian.
Yeah.
And I think it's a similar argument. Is Bitcoin a medium exchange or Bitcoin is a store of value, or which comes first or which comes later, right? So, I would assume that Roger, you're on that. You're saying the utility matters, and then the medium exchange comes before store of value. And so, can you sort of talk about that?
Sure. I would say that we think that in theory, that it's because something is able to be used as a medium of exchange that it then becomes a store of value, and we got to see that in practice with Bitcoin. The first time I ever heard about Bitcoin was in reference to people buying and selling drugs with it on the Silk Road. And personally, I wasn't interested in drugs. But when I heard about this money, what kind of money could they possibly be using to do this that couldn't be seized or stopped or blocked? And it was because people were using Bitcoin for that it then later became usable as a store of value. But it's only because it was usable in commerce that it ever became usable as a store of value. And if it had never been usable in commerce, it would have never became usable as a store of value in any way. And so I think Samson and people of his mindset think that you can separate those two things. But I think we have all the empirical evidence in the world that those two things are not separable. In order for something to be a store of value, it has to have a secondary use case. And in the case of Bitcoin, that secondary use case is being usable as payments. And if you destroy its usability in payments, you destroy its usability as a store of value. Would you like to add to that?
No, I think you have to have all of them. Even if you look at gold as an asset, you can still exchange it, right? I can give you a piece of gold, you can give me a piece of gold. The question is how easy it is to scale up that transaction, right? And how we go about doing it. I think if you use Bitcoin and you use Lightning, that would open up payments to be much more powerful because they are now instant.
When was the last time you made a Lightning payment?
Oh, a week ago.
A week ago? So I did more Bitcoin transactions on Bitcoin Cash today than I can count. How many shops are there that accept Lightning for payments online?
There's quite a few.
Can you name a few?
Yeah, Blockstream has a store.
Okay.
And then there's testnet stores. And I think someone else is selling art.
So I've heard two. Is there a third, or is it just two?
Yeah, I'm launching a hat store.
So there's two currently and a third one coming, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So here we have direct evidence that we've stagnated Bitcoin's adoption around the world by several years because there's two merchants that now accept Lightning and a third one where you can buy hats coming.
Lightning is not all in beta. 2 clients are in beta. A third is not yet.
So is there a third store that's live on the internet right now that I can make a Lightning transaction to buy something or engage in commerce?
So this is where we go back to the crypto Keynesian and crypto Austrian schools of thought. So if you want to sound money and you want
the answer was no?
Well, let me finish. If you want to sound money and you want to build something that can be usable, it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. Like Bitcoin took 9 years to get where it is today. And there's been a lot of improvements and scaling all along the way, but people haven't been paying attention to that except for when the block size debate happened. And I think the block size debate is the biggest bike shed in the world, because everyone can have an opinion, whether it's 1 megabyte, 2 or 2.5 or 3. But to build Lightning, it's going to take more than a couple weeks. It's only been 2 clients in beta for maybe 1 week.
How many years have people been working on Lightning now?
Maybe 2 years, 3 years. But building a protocol is not trivial, right? TCP was not built in a day. Bitcoin is a protocol, it's the internet of money, and Lightning is also another protocol. It does take time to build software.
What do you think about the fact that Bitcoin used to be the only digital currency that was accepted by thousands or tens or even hundreds of thousands of online shops for commerce? And now Litecoin and Dogecoin and Dash and all sorts of other ones are accepted at certainly more than the 3 Lightning Network shops online. They're already accepted at thousands. So that means the entire ecosystem, rather than moving from Bitcoin Core onto Lightning Network, they're moving from Bitcoin Core to 1,001 different altcoins. How does that make you feel as a Bitcoin maximalist?
Well, altcoins are inevitable, right? The software is open source. Anyone can create their own coin. There's incentives to create your own coin. So I don't see why it would have always been just Bitcoin by itself. But Bitcoin is still the most secure chain and the most reliable chain for storing value.
So I think we see, if for those of you that were in the room for my presentation, I gave the charts, we can see directly Bitcoin is losing market share to all these different altcoins, and that happened as soon as the blocks became full. So we had 2 different paths of action that we could have taken. We could have taken on the one that we had 8 years of empirical evidence showing that it worked incredibly well to grow Bitcoin into this worldwide phenomenon that it is today, which was just allowing the blocks to become as big as they need to be, as outlined by Satoshi. Or we can try and strangle that network by limiting the block size to 1 megabyte and forcing people onto these layer 2 solutions that basically don't even exist yet, in the hopes that maybe someday they'll be able to figure out all the details and make them work. And if and when they do figure out all the details to make Lightning Network work, it will work better, faster, cheaper, and more reliably on top of Bitcoin Cash than it will on top of Bitcoin Core. So the whole thing is just a bunch of nonsense in my book.
But Bitcoin Cash doesn't have SegWit.
And SegWit is not required for Lightning Network. So
It is?
it is not.
Okay.
And
so,
Google is the arbiter there. You can all go and Google it, and you'll see that I'm right on that fact as well.
so Samson, okay, so Roger believes that the store of value comes first, and then exchange, and you're saying that, collectible and store value.
Well, actually, I think
no,
all 3 are happening in parallel now.
Okay. Okay. So what's the future? So let's say the Lightning Network has been implemented, and it as it intended. Now you're saying it's in beta and it takes time. But let's say 5 years later that Lightning Network has been implemented. Then do you think that? So you do believe that there's a need for Bitcoin to be a small volume transaction, and buying coffee pretty much, yeah.
Well, you can buy coffee with Lightning.
How many coffee shops accept Lightning?
How many coffee shops accept Bitcoin?
A lot. And I go often in Tokyo to shops that do.
Good for you. That's wonderful. Well, the thing is, with Lightning, it actually makes more sense to transact, because if you're a merchant, then you actually do want the confirmations, right? Mm-hmm.
So as a merchant, I can tell you, if on the Bitcoin Cash network, we don't have to worry about confirmations. On the previous Bitcoin Core network, before replaced by fee, we didn't have to worry either. And we're actually seeing merchants that used to accept Bitcoin Core switching over to Bitcoin Cash because it actually works as cash. And there's no need for Lightning. There's already enough capacity available on the Bitcoin Cash network, and Bitcoin Cash transactions are already Lightning fast. So why do we need this second layer solution on top of a slow, expensive to use, unreliable chain that's having negative merchant adoption around the world? Basically, Bitcoin Core has been committing suicide with Bitcoin, which breaks my heart as the first person in the world to start investing in Bitcoin startups. Bitcoin Cash is building all the tools to make it useful as cash for the entire world, and that's why we're seeing merchant uptake around the world. And we're not seeing any merchant uptake of the Lightning Network at all, and we're seeing negative merchant uptake of the Bitcoin Core network at this point.
So your premise is that you don't need to wait for a confirmation for Bcash because you can trust everybody.
No. My premise is that zero confirmation transactions on Bitcoin Cash are already secure enough for merchants to accept, and we were already seeing some Bitcoin exchanges accepting zero confirmation transactions on the Bitcoin Cash network. And I think a real big difference of ideology we have on here is a lot of the Bitcoin Core supporters, they view zero confirmation transactions as either safe or not safe. And because they're not as safe as a transaction that's already been included in a block, we shouldn't try to make them safe at all. But that's not correct. It's actually this giant sliding scale from not safe at all to completely safe. And we should try to have them be as close to this side of the scale as we possibly can, which is what the Bitcoin Cash team is doing. Yes, they're not as safe as a transaction that's already been included in a block, but they're almost as good, which makes it plenty good enough to use in commerce. But people on the other side of this think because it's not as safe as a transaction that's been included in a block, let's not make it safe at all. And they succeeded in not making it safe at all on the Bitcoin Core network, whereas Bitcoin Cash, zero confirmation transactions are just fine and safe today for merchants to accept. And as a merchant accepting them, I know and I can tell you firsthand.
That's great.
Roger.
Thank you.
But isn't increasing the block size? Do you think increasing the block, simply just increasing without any second layer technology, is increasing block size a sustainable solution to you on Bitcoin Cash?
Sure. So increasing the block size is a sustainable long-term solution thanks to Moore's law. Computers get faster and cheaper, and storage hard drives get bigger and cheaper every single year. Think back when you were a kid and you first got on the internet. What speed was your internet connection? One of my first modems was a 2400 baud modem. It took, I think, over an hour to download a single megabyte. Now, at my office in Tokyo, we have a 2 gigabit connection, and it's about $35 a month. And I think here in South Korea, there's even faster internet connections. So thanks to Moore's law, just increasing the block size, which is what Bitcoin did the first 8 years of existence, is a long-term solution. And it's a solution that will work for the entire world. And that doesn't preclude layer 2 solutions either. You can do both. But instead, what we've seen happen on the Bitcoin Core network is that they've strangled Bitcoin's adoption and Bitcoin's growth by limiting the block size, in the hopes of creating these layer 2 solutions that might someday maybe work and allow you to buy things, but they don't exist yet. So they're destroying something that works right now today in the hopes of creating something that might work tomorrow, that in computer science looks to be a very, very, very difficult problem to solve. The routing problem is no small issue that they've just kind of not been worrying about yet because they have other more pressing issues, I suppose. But so the short answer is yes, just increasing the block size is a long-term solution to scale Bitcoin Cash to be used by the entire world.
Okay.
So
Do you disagree, Samson?
Well, the block size is increased. Again, it's 4 megabyte weight. So they are bigger now on Bitcoin. Physically, they are bigger in size. I think scaling by increasing the block size is a dead end. It's not just about the block and putting it in a chain. You have to actually validate the block when you receive it over the network. And there is constraints of time and space. It's not infinite. So if you get a block that's 500 megabytes, it will take you 20, maybe 30 minutes to validate that block before you can move on to the next one. And there is a dead end to that, right? You cannot keep increasing the block size, otherwise the network will never be able to validate the blocks that do come through. And I think that would be like 300 million people transacting would mean like making one transaction a day would make a 500 megabyte block.
And how many years do you think it would take for us to get to everybody in the world making that many transactions per day?
It depends. If the storage space is 0, then the incentive is to just put stuff into the blockchain, right? You can have colored coins, you have anything. And we're going to put anything into the blockchain because there's almost no cost, and it's valuable because every node on the planet has to save a copy of it.
So I think that shows our difference of opinion there. I think the miners should be able to decide what price they want to charge for the space in their blocks, whereas Samson thinks that a central group of people should decide how much block space the miners are produced. And in economics, that's called a production quota. And production quotas lead to bad outcomes. Whereas when you let the free market decide the amount of block space to produce, you'll have the most efficient allocation of that block space for the most number of people around the world. And so it's the difference between central planning versus the free market deciding. So in Bitcoin Cash, the free market decides how much block space to be produced. In Bitcoin Core, a couple of central planners are deciding.
Your block size is 8 megabytes, unless you make it variable.
I think it would be just fine to make it variable or to do away with it altogether. I think the miners can decide what the amount of block space.
You should totally do that.
Maybe we will.
Yeah, like it's not about setting something. First of all, the block size is set as a consensus rule. So there is no really good way to upgrade the network other than a hard fork where you tell everyone, OK, on this day, we're going to change the software. And everybody has to change the software. That is primarily why soft forks are used, because you don't have a flag day upgrade where, May 1st, everybody upgrades. You don't have to do that. So the network can upgrade by itself organically over time. And there you do run into time-space constraints. It takes time to validate a block. You cannot keep increasing it indefinitely.
This will probably the last question because we're supposed to end at 6.
Sure.
Well, leave the 2 questions. Just curiosity, why does it have to be such an animosity between Bitcoin and Bitcoin? It seems to be.
I'm happy to answer first.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So basically, there was this thing called Bitcoin, and there was a website called bitcoin.org, and there was a white paper describing how it worked, and there was a whole bunch of information on that website describing how this could scale to be cash for the entire world. And people started to use it as cash, and they started to buy and sell things, and they were telling their friends and family and setting them up with wallets, and people all over the world started to use it as cash. And then a bunch of people who came to Bitcoin much later started using all sorts of censorship and literally deleting people's posts that were advocating using Bitcoin in the same way that was described in the original Bitcoin white paper. They started mocking people who wanted to use Bitcoin to buy things like coffee. They started mocking people who wanted to use Bitcoin as described in the Bitcoin white paper. And they used censorship and propaganda to belittle those people. And then they basically diverted the entire Bitcoin project into something that wasn't usable as peer-to-peer cash, as described in the very title of the white paper. And so, of course, people who came to Bitcoin and wanted it to be money for the entire world were upset by the fact that a bunch of people who came to Bitcoin later used censorship and propaganda to divert the entire Bitcoin project into something that's not even remotely described in the Bitcoin white paper or on the original Bitcoin website. And then they want to call their project Bitcoin, and then they want to make fun of the actual Bitcoin that's described in the white paper by calling it names like Bcash. Of course people are going to be angry when that happens. And of course people that appreciate economic freedom are going to be upset because we've delayed the adoption of cryptocurrencies around the world by several years because of the censorship and propaganda and the diversion of the Bitcoin scaling roadmap. So that means more babies are dying in countries around the world because they have less economic freedom. More people are starving to death because they have less economic freedom. People are literally dying because of this. I'm not exaggerating. This is a life and death matter around the world, and more people are dying because we haven't been able to bring more economic freedom to the world as quickly as we otherwise would have been. And people like to make jokes about how Bitcoin isn't for people that make less than $2 a day. Well, I have news for you. Bitcoin is for everybody. And Bitcoin is alive and well in the form of Bitcoin Cash. And the thing that's currently called Bitcoin Core is some science project that's for a bunch of people living in first world countries with a bunch of money already and doesn't have the ability to help people that actually need the help the most. So that's why I'm mad about this, and that's why I'm passionate about this, because I want to see Bitcoin Cash be available for every single person on the planet, regardless of how much money they have or where they were born. What say you?
I think Bitcoin can be used by everybody, but it takes time for the technology to roll out. Just like when email first appeared, not everyone was using email. People still use normal mail. Not everyone had a computer. And I think that's the part the Bitcoin Core developers are focused on, which is keeping the requirement low to participate in the network. If you don't have a computer, you cannot use email, no matter how much I hope to help somebody, right? But we can lower the barrier by making the computer requirement less strict, right? You can have an old, 386 or something running, and you could still send email. I think that would be great. I think things like Lightning, once it matures, will be great because everyone will be able to transact, and they can do so without paying fees that can be volatile. Fees can go up and down, just like the weather can be hot one day, cool the next day, windy or rainy. It is fluctuating at any given time. So Lightning will be a more steady, more reliable method for transacting in Bitcoin.
The question was,
Yeah.
why do people hate
Why are you
Bitcoin
mad at
Cash?
me?
Oh, right.
And
Well, I think now that you have your own coin, BCH people have their own chain to promote. They can talk about the benefits of that chain and extol the virtues of that chain. There doesn't really need to be any animosity. I think people that support Bitcoin, Bitcoiners, Bitcoin hodlers, they don't like it because of how you branded it the same as Bitcoin. It's like if you have the economy and someone made the economy cash and then started selling tickets, then I don't think the organizers of the economy would like that very much. And I think that is where the animosity stems from, right?
So which version of Bitcoin do you think is described in the title of the white paper?
I think the title of the white paper is actually a nod to Chaumian eCash. eCash is a precursor to all of this stuff. And when Satoshi titled it, I think he just called it electronic cash because eCash.
So I have an example of how Bitcoin Cash works as cash right now today, and Bitcoin Core doesn't. So if you were to go to free.bitcoin.com, we send you a dime worth of Bitcoin Cash right now. That's impossible to do with Bitcoin Core today.
No, you can do that too.
The fees will be more than the money that they would have to send you on Bitcoin Core. So it's not.
There's a difference between priority and waiting. So it's just like mail. I can mail a letter for 45 cents, or I can send it priority with tracking for $45.
So what
It just depends how
website
fast.
can people go to today to get 10 cents worth of Bitcoin Core?
Well, no one's making faucet sites anymore because Bitcoin is valuable, right? If it's,
No, Bitcoin's always been valuable. So I received my first Bitcoin from a faucet run by Gavin Andreessen, somebody that people involved with your company, basically they claimed that they thought his account had been hacked, so they revoked his access to the repository. And when it turned out his account hadn't been hacked, they never restored his access to that. I think that's a really rude thing to do. And thank you, Gavin, for my first Bitcoin ever from a Bitcoin faucet. Bitcoin faucets now exist today on Bitcoin Cash. They no longer exist on Bitcoin Core because it's not usable as cash.
well, first of all, revoking Gavin's access has nothing to do with Blockstream. The people that have commit access, none of them work for Blockstream. And I think at that time, Gavin made
None
some
of them
pretty...
currently work for Blockstream, but some of them have since departed.
No?
Greg
Nobody
Maxwell.
at Blockstream. Greg Maxwell never had commit access to the repo. Repo is just a
You
repo.
can check Google on that as well. So.
Well,
And I believe-
Gavin
I
made some
believe it
pretty
was-
crazy claims, so
I
that
believe
people thought he
Gavin's
was hacked.
claim was that one of the biggest mistakes he ever made was trusting Greg Maxwell.
I don't think that was the cause. It was something else.
All right, we have like 2 minutes. I would
2-minute warning.
recommend people not to start a economy cash. That would be not good. All
Thank
right.
you so much for sharing your insight and your conflicting views, to say the least.
Thank you very much.
Really, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part in the discussions today.